Hello everyone and welcome back to the Slow Car Salon. I want to make my Miata handle even better than it already does, so today we're going to be installing some ground control coilover sleeves. So let's get started. So here are all the parts that are going to be installed. Of course, we have the ground control coilover sleeve kit with a pair for the fronts and a pair for the rears, as well as some Swaybar Endlinks that are fully adjustable from Goodwin Racing. The reason for installing those is so that we don't have any preload in the Swaybar once the car is lower than stock ride height. See, also about a year ago, I installed NB suspension in my NA, partly because I wanted to get away from the NA top hat design because the NB top hat design has better bushings and better NVH isolation. But what this resulted in was my ride height increasing an inch, even though I use the exact same brand springs from NA to NB. They're both Flyin Miata springs, since I previously had KYBs with NA Flyin Miata springs, and now these NB Flyin Miata springs, although they are the same spring rates, seem to have raised my car. This also means I lost some camber too, unfortunately, which has hindered the handling of the Miata. Thankfully, these ground control coilover sleeves are meant for Koni shocks, so they'll fit just perfectly. So let's jack the car up and start off with the fronts. Okay, so now that the wheels and also the under tray have been removed, we can start to get the struts out, or the coilover strut assembly out here. So what I'm gonna do is unbolt the strut from the control arm here, unbolt the end links on both sides, as well as remove the entire front upper control arm bolt out here, because that will allow me to kind of pivot the whole suspension assembly out of the way even more, especially once it comes time to remove the bolts at the top here. The whole assembly can come down, and then the front control arm can kind of pivot over and out of the way and allow the whole assembly to kind of just bend down and come straight out. Know this by experience, so this is just following the same procedure as I normally would. And there it is, pretty straightforward. Of course, if your Miata has never been apart before or nothing's been taken apart for a little while, I would suggest making sure to break out the WD-40 and the hammers. But otherwise, this slipped out pretty easily. So now next, we got to get some spring compressors on here, compress the Flyin Miata spring down in order to remove the top hat. Don't do this. Don't try this at home. Although I will admit, it was pretty darn fun. So you're gonna get some spring compressors on these springs, compress it down, and then unbolt and remove the top hat and its bushings, and then we're gonna see how the ground control stuff goes on. Okay, so the assembly is now apart. I guess it was under less tension than I thought because the spring compressors didn't really do too much. So maybe I can use my more aggressive method, I guess you could say, in order to get the springs off. But here it is. This is the original spring seat, and there's this little ring or collar here where the new ground control stuff is going to sit on. The bump stop, which I know is upside down. We're going to cut a little section out of this too, and the other like top hat, cup washer stuff and rubber bushings that would go up on this part. And now our newly assembled coilover can be reinstalled. So I'm going to throw that back in, as well as replace that stock end link there with the new unit, making sure I can still have it somewhat loose so I can make adjustments later once everything goes back together. But it's time to throw it back in. All right, now the assembly is back in. I have not yet attached the end link at the bottom of the control arm here until I do the other side. So once I can do that, I'm also going to actually tighten up the upper control arm bolt, because the suspension is supposed to be loaded when that's tightened up. So I'm going to rinse and repeat for the other side to get the new coilover in, and then we can adjust our end link lengths as well as torque down those bolts. All right, right, now both sides are in. I also set the collar height here from the bottom to the bottom of the collar, bottom of gold, bottom of collar, to about 2 1/16 inch. So I'll use that as my ride height base. I haven't connected the end link here on this side as well. So what I'm going to do now is put the wheels back on both sides and get some blocks underneath the car so the car can sit on top of the block and I can still access everything underneath. That way I can set my ride height, and then once I've set the ride height, then I can set the end link length and make sure it doesn't have any preload in it. And there we go. It took me a little while to play with the settings and also get the Swaybar end links in. A little bit more on that later. But what I did is I adjusted my collars up and down, and my measurement was from this point of the fender down to the center of the wheel. And previously, before, when I had the NA KYB shocks and Flyin Miata springs, that distance was 12.5 inches. At first it dropped to 12, so I raised it back up, and now we're pretty much good on both sides. So it's exactly where I want it, which is awesome. Quick note on the Swaybar end links here. You may have seen me put them on the inside of the Swaybar over here, but they're really meant to go on the outside like shown. And I bolted them in, but the supplied bolts that come with the Goodwin Racing end links are way too long. So I used my own M10 bolt with a flange nut and used some blue Loctite on that end. Because yeah, over here are the nuts that come, or sorry, bolts that come with it, and they're just far too long for that space, especially when they're right next to the tie rod. Considering you have to slit them in right there, right by the tie rod, and it's kind of hard to get in there, so having the appropriately sized bolt helped out a lot. So the next step is to work on the rear, and the rear begins in the trunk. So to begin, we actually have to remove this cover plate here. This normally hides all of the gas filler tank lines and whatnot, but the shock tower bolts are behind there, as the other ones are already accessible over here, right, like there. So first step is to actually get this off. Of course, we can start by getting the spare or stock jack handle out of the way. And then in my case, I have a bolt here that also houses this cover plate, which is actually a very, very useful piece because this prevents any stuff that's in the trunk from actually slamming into the metal behind it, which actually is just part of the body right here. So having that cover plate has actually been really nice. But we got a bolt to remove there, as well as a couple others around the perimeter. Gotta snake it past my gas trunk strut here and the bracket. It's just usually just a way to kind of slip it underneath, but if you don't have a trunk gas strut like this, this whole thing should just pop right out. And then after that, we can jack up the rear. And just like that, the car is jacked up and we got the wheels off. Now, procedure for the back is same as the front pretty much. You got to remove a bolt down in here for the shock. Got to remove the end link off both the sway bar and the control arm just because we're also replacing them. I already removed the two nuts up top in the trunk, which if you found them annoying to get off on this side, it's well because they are annoying to get off on this side. I guess unless you remove the fuel pipes, but I kind of feel like that's just a little bit too much in order to get at those bolts. I think you can get it kind of snake in there with a 14mm deep socket and a nice long wrench like this. This one's from Harbor Freight. So I think that worked out just fine. Coming back down here, to help us get the control arms and stuff out of the way in order to get the shock assembly out of here, we're going to also remove the top bolt from the knuckle off the control arm. And that's pretty much it. So time to get started on that. That's the rear side in. Now, insulation for the coilover portion itself was pretty much identical to the fronts. Again, we're cutting out 1/4 inch of the bump stop off of the top. Whole thing went in. I already secured the two nuts for the top hat up there. New Swaybar end link is in. Now, I will mention I did change out, even for the fronts, this center link here for one of the shorter ones that Goodwin Racing ships you, because the normal one they send is far too long. So I also did this in the front. We'll be doing so for the other side. So now time to put the coilover assembly in on the other side, and then set our ride height, set our end link lengths, and then we should be good to go. All right, well, I just got done assembling the final shock absorber coilover here, and I just realized I swapped the springs front and rear. That's kind of a headache, but I will admit that ground control doesn't provide any of that information with the documents they send with this kit, which really sucks because now I have to take out the fronts as well now. Thankfully I didn't install this side, so I can easily take out the rear. I think I'll just jack up the front, take those out, and then swap the springs out, but I really wish I had known beforehand because, like I said, there's nothing from the ground control documentation that says which one's front, which one's rear. And the way I found out is that I was noticing how high up this has to go up this spring perch, and I thought, that's not quite right. And what I noticed is that, and after I looked up the part number on the spring itself, is that these 150.64.66, those are the 375-pound springs, and the other ones, which is GC 180.64.44, those are the 250-pound springs, which are meant for the rears, which I happen to swap out. So it kind of sucks, but got to take the whole front out again and just swap them out. So hey, at least at this point, if you made the same mistake, you have at least taken everything out once, so it's going to be much faster this time around. Time to get to work. And with a little bit of cinema magic, I've got the front and rear springs swapped back out. So finally, I can get these thrown in and all dialed in. So with a little bit more time lapse in cinema magic, I'll have these in no time. Now that everything is finally back in, all I have to do now is just set the ride height exactly where I want it. There we go. I am now back to my previous ride height settings before I swapped out for the NB stuff. And I got my rake going from front to rear, set I think to about 1/2 inch of rake for right now. I can always adjust that later, hence the beauty of those adjustable coilover sleeves, which means even now I could get the whole car corner balanced, but it's just a street car. I'm not doing anything crazy with autocross or racetrack, so I think I'll omit that for now. And just as a special treat for the car, as I put the wheels back on, I got these really nice Muteki Super Tuner lug nuts in red, because my original lug nuts, while they were really cool, and they had this 8-point, or I guess double square spline drive for them, they were starting to get pretty faded, and I wanted to reinstate that vibrance with some new lug nuts. So, threw those on, they fit great, they look great. And final note, don't forget to torque your nuts. Of course, it was time to go and take a test drive. The coilover kit helped the handling of the Miata in so many different ways. Of course, because the car was lower, I get a lower center of gravity, and due to the Miata's suspension geometry, I actually gained a little bit of camber as well. The spring rates are extremely well matched to the dampers too. I didn't even have to change any of the damper settings. Even though they are stiffer than what they were before, they're still extremely compliant for the street. Overall, the modifications to the Miata made for an extremely pleasant and balanced driving experience while giving me much more confidence with corner turn-in and exit. And that's going to be it for this episode. Tune in next time because we're going to be doing one of the most difficult jobs on the Miata. If you're a Miata owner, you might know what I'm talking about. If not, well, just stay tuned and you'll find out.